Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brent Crowe, and I have the privilege of serving here at Student Leadership University. Well, if you've not watched anything else, you're stepping into the first of many conversations this year with our first ever Scholar in Residence. Now, very quickly, here's the idea. If you want to hit the pause button and go hear exhaustively what the Scholar in Residence is all about, look at the previous video. But if you don't want to do any of that, we are privileged to have a great thought leader walk alongside us to resource youth ministry practitioners such as yourself, primarily in apologetics, worldview, and culture type questions and issues. We reached out and asked for some response. We did that a couple of ways. We sent an old-fashioned e-blast, and then through our YPS registration and a social media post here or there. But here's the good news. There has been an incredible response. Literally thousands of youth ministers and youth workers and youth pastors across the country have responded. So I just want to say this on the front end. Some questions might, throughout the course of the year, get left out because there's so many. And thank you so much for your response. But we're going to do our best. I actually have a person who is going through every response, cataloging it, categorizing it, so that we can try to address as many, or so Dr. Brown can try to address as many topics as possible. But one of the topics that arose over and over again across all the responses or a lot of the responses, was this general idea of apologetics. Okay, what is it? What does that look like in 2023? I might have known what that was 20 years ago, or heard what that was 20 years ago, or heard my pastor talk about it at some point. But what is it? What is it, and why is it important now? And what does it look like now? And so that's going to be the conversation that Dr. Brown will be having with us today. He's going to help us get our head around what it is and what does it look like, and then how you can get prepared to do the work of apologetics in your ministry. I promise you, by the end of this conversation, you're going to feel equipped with the right direction. Now, you may not have all the answers, but you'll be given the tools to start chasing down some of those answers and being able to do that work of giving a reason for the faith that is the hope that is within you on a regular basis with students as they struggle through questions. So that's where we're headed today. Dr. Brown, I know I've said it 1,000 times. I'm crazy excited about this. This is going to be a great conversation. I don't know about you, but I was a little overwhelmed by thousands of responses that quickly in a matter of just a few days. But we have a lot of youth pastors that are going to be listening. And so I know you're excited about that response as well.
Yes, I am. And I think it's indicative of our cultural moment as well.
Yeah.
Because the youth pastors are seeing online, they're hearing from their youth, they have questions, and they want to be able to answer them well,
yeah,
and truthfully and so on. And that just doesn't happen by accident. So
No.
I have to be very intentional.
Yes, sir.
Very intentional. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Well, let's. I want to start out this way. And if I'm wrong on this, feel free to correct me, Doc. Pretend that I'm back in the classroom and you're my professor again, and you can give me an F on this if you want to. But
Okay.
I want to go ahead and I want to give a disclaimer. I want to go ahead and squash a myth. And the myth is this, that unless you have a degree or unless you've read all the right books, you really can't do apologetics in your student ministry. That's not really true, is it?
Well, no, it's not true. And I'm afraid that is a thought that would have. I think the most important apologist in the church is the youth pastor.
Yes, sir.
Now, the senior pastor is for the congregation, but the real battle is being fought for the hearts and minds of the teens,
Mm-hmm.
the youth. And they get input from so many different sources, particularly now in this cultural moment. I mean, all you got to do is watch TikTok for about 10 minutes, and you will probably hear some anti-Christian comments, and you will hear some ideas about the Bible that aren't true, and so on. And That's just one example. So how do you answer that? How do you respond to that?
Yeah.
And so this is one thing that it really helped me a lot, and that is that young people have questions.
Hmm.
And if they have unanswered questions, they're going to struggle with their faith, sometimes discard it. But not just unanswered questions, if they have unquestioned answers, that is easy answers,
Mm.
that's going to struggle, to make them struggle in their faith. And the youth pastor is in a really sweet spot to be able to bridge that gap.
Yeah.
And yeah, so stop it there. That's the whole purpose of, I think, of youth ministry is apologetics, not only discipleship, but apologetics. Those really go hand in hand.
Right. Right. So, guys, I just want to say, because I know a lot of times for me, Doc, the reason I wanted to start there is because a lot of times I feel overwhelmed. I've been in student ministry for over 20 years, but I still at times feel overwhelmed when I look at the tsunami of issues and questions and, gosh, how am I going to wrestle through that? How am I going to help a student think through that? And one of the things that's kind of been an encouragement to me is what Paul taught Timothy in 2 Timothy 3:16 and beyond, where he's talking about how basically the Word of God can prepare you for everything that you'll come in contact with in the future. It really is. This is the impact of the Word of God, so that you can be fully prepared. So I wanted to say that at the beginning because I want the youth pastor who may have been a carpenter and he knew there was a need in his church and the Lord called him to it, but he's never been to Bible school, seminary. He's not. I want him to know, or her to know, that they where they are, if they're willing to work hard, if they're willing to wrestle with students, that they can do the work of apologetics in the context of their student ministries. And I think that that's a word that needs to be said up front. So what is it? Let's start with the idea. What is it, and why has it been important in the history of the church?
Well, I think it's been a part of the history of the church. Number one, it's very biblical. And in the first Peter 3 passage, it's pretty well known to always be ready to give a defense, to give an answer, an explanation to those who ask a question. And usually apologetics is in response to a question that is asked.
Yes, sir.
And that's the idea. And we see it done by the Apostle Paul, and we have throughout history. I mean, you just read, I finished Augustine's Confessions again not long ago, and that's full of apologetics, you
Yes,
know.
sir.
And so that's what the church has been doing, answering questions. And it's not just questions coming from the outside, it's questions from within, basic questions. And so an apologist is a person who is trained to answer those questions. Problem is, whether you like it or not, if you're in a teaching ministry of any sort, you need to be an apologist. And well, you are an apologist.
You are,
Either you're a
yes, sir.
good one or a bad one.
Right.
Right. And I think everybody watching right now, they're thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to study and get all this stuff in my head when I get a question. You don't have to do it that way. And we'll talk about that along the way. But you do need to be in apologetics thinking. In fact, I have been reading apologetics every day for since you were a child. You know, a little bit of apologetics every day is awesome.
Yes, sir.
You know, and it can be C.S. Lewis, or it can be just on Christian Answers, ChristianAnswers.com. And they have a teen section on there, questions that teens answer, and so on, those kinds of things. Or I work out every morning, as you can tell, and I watch YouTube videos of some of the sessions where apologists are at Ohio State University or at Valparaiso or so on, listening to college students, give them questions and listen to how they answer. Those things, they're really great, and they really help give you a perspective of what you should be saying and how.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You know, like you said, since I was a wee lad, you've been doing this, and studying this. What would you say has changed over the last, say, 25, 30 years? What's different now? I mean, you've taught people how to see the world through the grid of Scripture better than anybody I know for a very, very long time. But a good professor, a good teacher, is always contextualizing based on the current realities. And so, what is? I mean, I know there's some very obvious things, but what would you say are some fundamental shifts that have happened over the last since 25, 30 years ago?
Well, I think communication technology has probably changed the calculus of all this, because usually there were major questions that people would ask about God, about the problem of evil,
Mm-hmm.
is the Bible reliable, et cetera, et cetera. And probably the last book that people remember the most would be Josh McDowell's book,
Mm,
Evidence Demands a Verdict. But once social media came along, and then this became the great discipler of our young people.
right.
Um, I mentioned TikTok. I mean, it's overwhelming, and there's a lot of Christian kids that are finding that their faith is being challenged all the time that they get on social media, and they're confronted with questions. They're listening to artists, whether it be music artists or maybe somebody that they really enjoy in sports, make negative comments about Christianity or God or whatever, and they don't know what to do with that.
Mm,
They're hesitant to ask questions, and so they just kind of keep it in, and
hmm
that kind of stews and it accumulates, and I think can become a real problem for them. And then their friends don't have much to help them with either.
right.
And that's where the youth pastor, I think, plays a very, very strategic role in what God is doing.
Yeah. It seems to me there's a book that's not out yet. It's coming out in about a month, called The Digital Fast by Dr. Darren Whitehead. I think you've met Pastor Darren before. He pastors in Franklin, Tennessee. And I recently read an advanced copy of that, and the first part of his book is just kind of bringing all the social science together in a way that's translatable for us common people to understand. And he mentioned the real world research that's been done on attention because of like the supercomputer that we carry around in our pockets,
Right.
and how that attention deficit now that has been created has drastically impacted the spiritual disciplines, that drastically impacts the ability for us to think Christianly. And he also pointed out that it has stunted our ability. He pointed this out, but the research pointed it out, and he brought it to light. It's stunted our ability to have three types of relationships. The relationships, number one, a relationship with ourself, to be self-aware. There's a decreasing self-awareness because of how this supercomputer in our pocket. Number two, our immediate community, like our family. And then number three, God. And so if you don't have if you can't listen more than 2 seconds to those around you, if you can't focus on your own self and what you're thinking about for more than 5 seconds, and if you can't listen to God or talk to God for a full prayer without getting distracted, boy, we've really set ourselves up to not be able to think deeply about some of these questions, haven't we?
Yeah, that's so true. And the visual impact of, for example, just short video, whether it be YouTube, and so on, it's a different way of thinking, as opposed to reading a book or reading an article or something. Your mind works differently. You're reading, you're in control. You go back, you can process it. In a video, a movie, a music video, whatever, you're not in control,
Right.
and it's much more impacting you on an emotional level. But yeah, the short form of almost everything just really cuts into being able to, in any meaningful way, involve yourself in those relationships you just described.
So let's say it this way. If we were to put it into the format of a kind of a little bit of a principle, a short form is not a shortcut. A short form is a downfall. And it
Yeah.
actually does a lot more damage than it does good. Well, this is the problem, okay? So far somebody may be listening and going, okay, thank you, Captain Obvious, Dr. Brown, and Thank you for those Captain Obvious questions, Brent. Let's get to so how does a youth ministry, minister, how does somebody who is a youth ministry practitioner, how do they go about preparing themselves to do the work of apologetics on a regular, most youth pastors, Doc, are going to have a midweek Bible study. They're going to meet with a couple small groups themselves. They're going to have youth workers that meet with a couple some small groups, and they're going to have a weekend gathering. That's pretty much what they got. And of course, technology does give them a little bit more avenue on a little bit more rhythmic level throughout the week, but or at least the possibility of that. But what can somebody go, I need to do this. I know I need to do this. How do I prepare myself to do this? What does that look like?
Well, I think, just as I mentioned earlier, you should be reading apologetics or watching apologetics or watching apologetics all the time. To me, it's an everyday thing. It's not a long time, but just over the period of time, getting your mind around the issues, what the questions are, the best ways to answer them, the best ways not to answer them, and so on. And once you get in the habit of doing that, it's really like potato chips. You want to keep going because it's really helpful.
Yeah.
And but secondly is to create an environment among your young people where it's okay to ask questions, even difficult questions.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, don't make it so that it's comfortable. Just make it it's expected. It's expected. And to be very matter of fact about it, say, the Christian worldview says this about this. The Christian worldview says this about this. The world is saying this. So there's a conflict. And so how do we as Christians respond to that, the problem of evil? Or how do you deal with the fact that this, my friend, she says that she thinks she's really a boy.
Mm-hmm.
But what do I say to her? And you say, well, that's not in the Bible per se, but what do we say to help them deal with a lot of the anxiety that comes from all of that?
Yes, sir.
But again, the idea is constantly let students ask questions. Now, sometimes I've seen youth pastors, because they have a large youth group or even a smaller youth group, where asking a difficult, challenging question is very difficult. And so how do you do that? Well, they can do it. You can make it so that they can write it out and put it in a box, or you can send you an email or whatever, and you can respond publicly to it. But make it as comfortable as possible, but as expected as possible. And the idea is, all the time that they are being challenged by social media, their faith is being negated, their faith is being criticized, their faith is being parodied, that you're the one that can help them.
Right.
And let God use you to give them confidence and faith. Always ready to give an answer.
Yes, sir.
And back in Ephesians, at the end of Ephesians in chapter 6, the Apostle Paul says, pray for me so I'll have words to say, when I have questions and I can answer them.
So, Doc, what you're talking about is culture. What you're saying is, if it's expected, like we expect to be able to wrestle with tough questions, sometimes some even hard answers. But you're saying because that's expected, you're going, that's the kind of culture that we're creating. My favorite definition of culture comes from the indigenous people who define culture this way, that culture is shared memory. Mm-hmm. And it's just a simple definition, which I think is also pretty, profound. And your culture is based on some kind of shared memory. And so if you're a ministry and you're ministering to students and you have this long catalog of shared memory that revolves around what the Bible teaches and real-world Christianity and tough questions and struggling through answers and all that, that to me, that kind of a culture, and I'm not being disparaging to people who take a much more attractional approach to ministry, and I think there's a place for having a lot of fun in student ministry and doing silly things and all that, but I'm saying if the heart of your culture is that, you're willing to do the hard things and you're willing to wrestle with these answers versus the heart of your culture being something that's a little less substantial.
Hmm.
I just
Hmm.
think for the long haul, the longevity and the the long-term health, of a student ministry that revolves around that culture that's willing to wrestle is the kind of ministry that sees multiple generations of disciples.
That's good. That's good. And the focus of our ministry is always Jesus Christ
Yes, sir.
and the gospel. And but we live in a culture. Well, we've always lived in cultures that are antagonistic towards that.
Hmm.
And the youth pastor, I think, is called to mentor what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ, to face difficult questions, difficult issues, but to do it with kindness and thoughtfulness and faith
Right.
and so on. That goes so far to help young people
Hmm.
who, when they get into that state of anxiety and depression and suicide, that you have shown them that those difficulties do not in any form or fashion change the truth
Yes, sir.
we've been teaching.
Yes, sir.
And so that's where I think the role of the youth pastor is essential. Not so much that he or she can say the right things, the good things, the true things, but the way in which he or she says it,
Yes,
you
sir.
know, and confidently with joy and so on. And sometimes to admit, I don't know, but we're going to find out. We're going to find out.
That's a very important point, Doc. It may go farther in a student's mind because I've had to do this before, and there was times where I tried to make something up, which is horrible. We've all
I've
probably
never done that. I've never
yeah,
done that.
I'm where I try to fake it till I make it. But I think the reality is it's okay to say, you know what, I'm on a journey too. I mean, I'm being sanctified here too. I don't know, but I'm confident we can find out together. I think that can go a long way in helping a student to think Christianly that's struggling with their faith.
So good. Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah.
let's talk. We start out up here, Doc. We're getting more and more practical the longer we talk. Okay, based on your personal experience and observation, what are some practical steps a youth ministry can take to create that kind of environment? What have you seen, in other words, that's working on a practical level to help them create an environment to do the work of apologetics?
I think a lot of it is just the approach that you have. If you're, for example, if you have your group meetings and you're focusing on a particular discipleship approach, and in that context, you can model for them, all right, this passage here or this passage over here says this and this, and you've got that's troubling. So what do you do? And then you have prepared yourself to be able to explain that, because now atheists would say this.
Mm-hmm.
A Hindu would say this, but what we know from the scriptures is this, and this is how we address that. And it's it's good that you're always prepared to do that. Now, you're not going to always be prepared to give the right answer. Therefore, you probably want to bring it up as something that you've already studied and said,
Mm-hmm.
okay, a lot of people struggle. Like the problem of evil is why evil even exists, and the fact that it exists and God doesn't get rid of it right now is probably the number one question from teens now.
Yeah.
And
Which is not funny, but funny in a way that's been the number one question historically.
exactly. And so getting a prepared response to that's very thoughtful, and there's lots of good ways to respond to that. Basically, it goes down to God giving us free will in the sense of choosing and so on. I like to take that approach. There are some other approaches too, but that love requires a choice, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And young people get that. They see that and they
Mm-hmm.
say, okay. And the scriptures explain that, God did not let evil come in or slip in because he wasn't paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
We chose that.
Yes, sir.
And all of scripture is God taking care of that.
Yes, sir.
The 4 chapters of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, of how we look at the world of every individual. And then you look at creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Oh, now we see how God is pulling all that together. Big picture kinds of things help them. But I do a little bit of apologetics every time we get together.
Yes, sir.
They expect it,
Yes, sir.
and or they ask questions. Now, you remember I told you about, well, I went to Russia in and out and former Soviet Union for 10, 11 years when I was at Bryan. I did
Yes,
that,
sir.
And I was mainly lecturing speaking to university faculty and K through 12 faculty sometimes. And they had so many questions because they were atheists. And here I am talking about the Christian worldview. And but it was delightful because that's where the changes occurred. I
Yeah.
mean, that's where they were surprised that we would do Q&A, because you don't do Q&A, if the instructor stands up and says this, that's it. But I would do Q&A, and sometimes it would be over an hour, and they would just line up to ask questions. And it just was amazing to them that there was such an openness
Yeah.
about being able to handle difficult questions.
I think we would be surprised. I think there's a fear, and I think we all struggle with fear. We have to remind ourselves that God's not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of sound mind. But I think there is a tendency for everyone to be afraid of the unknown. And so if you're in student ministry and what you have is a program where you play a game, you sing 2 songs, and then there's a very practical message, and everybody goes to have Chick-fil-A afterwards or something, I mean, and then we go to camp once a year, we do a mission trip, and you've got this system, but you're never really doing the work of apologetics. There is probably a little bit of fear in the mind and the heart of that leader to go, I just don't know if I'm capable, if I'm equipped, if I'm able, does it open up Pandora's box? And what I've found, because I've been afraid a lot when it comes to those types of questions in my own journey, especially cross-cultural situations like what you were dealing with in Russia, is usually the other side of that fear is not as scary as I thought it was. I'll give you a very quick example. There's a certain tradition in certain Muslim countries, not all, but certain Muslim countries, where if you ask an imam a question, they, out of honor and respect, will ask you a question in return, and that's a cultural way of honoring a guest. And so I remember the first time I did that in a particular country, where I went, and it was in a mosque, and there was about 20 of us, but I went, okay, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to ask the question. And as soon as I did, and he asked me a question, I answered, it was like there was this whole world of dialogue opened up, and it was not full of fear. It was a beautiful thing. And I think we feel that way with our students sometimes. Like, if I open up I'm opening up Pandora's box, but it's not. What you're doing is you're creating a space for them not to have a type of approach to Christianity that can be easily dismissed when they go off to college. Now, I don't want to ever use a fear tactic, but there are some consequences, aren't there, Doc, if we don't do this? What is that?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And we see the results of that regularly. In fact, one of the things that with Christian schools, I've spoken in many, many Christian schools, and one of the main topics of conversation is how so many of their top Christian leaders at the school, when they go to college, they have completely jettisoned their faith in the first semester.
Yeah.
But let me add this to a very practical thing, because there could be some youth pastors out there going, "Oh my gosh, I can't be ready for all these questions."
Right.
And this is what I encourage you to do. When you got your group together, say, "Okay, I want everybody," and give them paper and pen and so on. I want you to write out a question that struggles. Write it on a piece of paper, fold it up, and we'll take them up, and we'll try to answer some of these next week.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe work your way through that. And that gives the youth pastor the opportunity to do some research, to go to christiananswers.com and so on, and to get a good response. And they begin to see, when they hear their question answered, they go, that's awesome, And it develops a sense of environment. It's okay to ask questions, and there are some good answers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good one, because you can say, okay, now what attacks against Christianity have you seen and heard recently?
Hmm.
And some of them will speak up on that. You can write them down. It's like, we'll talk about this next week or something.
Yeah. One of the we're talking about ways to create that environment, Doc. Technology is a double-edged sword. Obviously, there's quite a bit of negative, but there's also some very positive things that have done it. I've been in ministries where the youth pastor will have them text in their questions. I've been in contexts where they do it in a small group session, and the youth pastor or youth leader on stage, kind of like a master teacher, and then go to small group vibe, where they'll prime the pump with, here are some sample questions, but they won't give the answers on stage, because the point is to get to the questions. Yeah. And then they go to their small groups, and then the small group leaders, their job is simply to try to mine those questions. And then that youth pastor will take, okay, so for the month of May, or for the month of August, or for these 6 weeks, we're going to address a different question every Wednesday night. And then I remember, for example, years ago, there was a particular church in the Atlanta Metroplex who said, I want you to come in and teach that ethic thing you teach. I was like, okay, what ethic thing? How do you make decisions? And it was a book I'd written called Chasing Elephants. And I went, you want me to do a technical thing on a Wednesday night? And he wanted 4 Wednesday nights. And what happened is, by the time we got to the 4th week, the room was hundreds and hundreds of people. And we started out with only a couple hundred. And it was but it was meaty, it was systematic, it was a tool, it was a resource. They were learning how to think. And what it taught me is, there's really an appetite for this kind of stuff. And so what you've got to do is figure out, as a youth pastor, youth leader, youth worker, how do you tap into that appetite? And there's a lot of ways to do it. And then it may not be addressing it just on a Wednesday night or a Sunday morning or something like that. It may be that you have small groups go through a resource. Or it may be that you go, okay, I'm going to use this YouTube thing for the glory of God, and go, this is a closed thing just for our student ministry. But also, hey, here, all these questions will be systematically addressed in this platform, which probably will stir up more conversation and more questions, and that's good. But we're going to, I think using all that technology, using those avenues, only furthers to create that environment. I want to mention one other thing, and I'd like you to speak to this. This is a primary way or method that we do evangelism. And I think sometimes that gets overlooked a lot in our Christian circles when we talk about apologetics. Apologetics is not just defending the faith so that you can win an argument. Apologetics should have as its end goal that you see somebody won to Christ. And so would you speak to the role of apologetics in evangelizing the unredeemed?
Yeah, I think apologetics has an incredible evangelistic appeal because it does several things. One, it does answer specific problems. When I talk to even some of my family, extended family, when we get together, they know what I do, and so they'll come up and say, well, I can't believe in God because of this and this and this. And giving an answer, it's like, Mm-hmm. In many ways, it's taking down a block, or at least the block that they have said keeps them from coming to know God, and that's gone. So that opens up. But it also gives the perspective that God is seeking after you, and that there are answers, that you can have questions. It's a relationship. We talk about worshiping the Lord, which is great, but we all worship something. That's the nature of being human. But worship is not a relationship. Worship is praising, but then the relationship that we have through prayer and through interaction with the Holy Spirit, that is what's unique about Christianity.
Yeah.
And once people begin to experience that, it's really transformative for them. And so they begin to ask questions, and when they find that there are good, solid answers for them, then they think, maybe there's more to this than I thought.
Yeah, that this is more than just a moral code that a certain tribe follows. One of the things that I'm picking up from you is that behind all of the new questions are questions that never change. And so, for example, you mentioned the problem of evil, and in my 20 plus years of student ministry, that's the number one question. But the way that question is asked changes from week to week.
Right.
How could God allow a world where there's sex trafficking? How could God allow a world where there's a child with cancer? How could God allow a world where this single mom gets abused? Or, all these different ways this question has fleshed itself out. And but behind that is the problem of evil question. And so I think by way of strategy, if you've created an environment, by way of strategy of engaging that environment on a rhythmic level, on a regular, is to always go back to that big picture. Well, what you're talking about when you bring up why, the fact that my friend was abused as a child. What you're talking about is the fact that there is evil in this world. Well, what is that? And how did that happen? And of course that takes us back to the creation narrative and what you've already mentioned. You mentioned Augustine or if you're from the South, St. Augustine. But Augustine, I think, wrestled with the problem of evil as well as any theologian ever did. And
Right.
really, Augustine's like, hey, evil is not addition, evil is subtraction. It's not creation, it's decreation. And so I've always gone back and said to students, like, okay, so whatever that question may be, behind that question, you're talking about evil in this world. And of course, yeah, that's what I'm talking about, they would say. And then, well, what is evil? Evil is not God doing something. It is man doing something to take away from what God has already created. That's resonated with a lot of students. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, what has God given us? He's given us the power to have creativity. He's given us power to know his desires. He's given us the Holy Spirit of God. And so he's given us the opportunity to step into what has been decreated and to see something restored that honors God and protects certain people. And so I think there's by way of strategy. Okay, so we talked about all these things. We got to environment, but by way of strategy on a regular is to know how to always source your answer in the questions that are never changing, but being expressed in a different way. And if you can start there, I think you're going to get a student to listen closer. And then you can begin to flesh out through some other ways addressing specifically that issue based on. And of course, we're using problem of evil because it's the most commonly cited one. But I think that, so okay, there's that strategy, and I'm hearing you say that strategy over and over again, Doc. Okay, with that in mind, how does a youth worker keep up with the? I mean, I remember walking in your office as a student and seeing multiple magazines on the little table out in front of your office, Rolling Stone, and all these different magazines, and going, man, this doesn't seem like a Christian college, university president or whatever. This is, but you were always, I know that was then, everything's changed now and everything's digital but you said, I'm doing this to keep up. I want to know what people are thinking, what people are wrestling with, what people are saying, what ideas are being tossed around. So, okay, here we are. It's 2020. I almost said it's 2023. It's 2020. What year are we in? It's 2024, right? I almost said 2023. Anyways, it's 2024. Gosh, man, I'm struggling to keep up. How does a youth worker minister keep up in 2024?
Well, it's technology does make it a little bit easier to keep up. And there's some good resources. Before we go, let's hear some resources, too.
Yeah.
But which will help you do that. And the reason I say that is what a youth pastor does, so busy, needs so
Yes,
much
sir.
to do, so many people to take care of. Because you got the kids and the parents, and you got the church and the members and all that. So there's quite a bit of challenging in relationships to keep up with. But if you really want to stay up, like I said, that's why you do a little bit each day. You read like a good apologetics book. and how they answer one particular challenge to the Christian faith. And then you read that, and the next day you read another one, and you go back and read that one. The idea being that it's kind of cumulative, and you
Hmm.
want to do it, but keeping up is important, and that's why I like some of the websites and so on, where they will be talking to students, college students, high school students, right now, and questions are raised, and how do they answer them? What is going on? And there is always reward for keeping up.
Yes.
And that's one of those things that should be a priority. This is the culture in which God has given to us. And God has called us, God has called you into this culture right now to represent Him well. And so yeah, there's all kinds of things. We can be more specific if you like.
I think we
Uh,
should. Like, what would you say? Give me. Let's start with books. What are a couple of apologetic books that you would say you should have this one on your shelf? And by the way, in answering that, how do they get a hold of the book you wrote on worldview?
um, Amazon.
Yeah, is that the answer for everything? Mark of the
Yeah,
Beast, Amazon. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
the mark of the beast. Yeah.
What's the name of that book, Doc?
Making sense of your world.
And that book, I just want everybody to know, is ingrained in my thinking. It's ingrained in my thinking that the ability to go, okay, here's the big picture, never changing questions behind all of the questions that might be raised. And I know you don't like to toot your own horn, but that book will help position you to be able to think that way. It'll give you that foundation to create your strategy on. So I think Making Sense of Your World by Dr. Bill Brown, I'd encourage everybody to get a copy of that one. What would be another book or two? And then I want to look at some podcasts and YouTube channels, things of
Yeah,
that nature.
I think that there's so much good apologetics coming out now, which is very, very exciting for me because they're very aware of the very things we're talking about right now. One of the best apologists right now is Rebecca McLaughlin. She's from Cambridge,
Amazing.
and she's the best. In fact, we've had her with the Colson Center doing some things for us and so on. She actually has a series navigating a gospel truth for teens, which is really good. But she also has a book called The Secular Creed, where she takes
Yep.
the rainbow
Mm-hmm.
signs that people have out, and she takes each one of those. Love is love, women's rights are human rights, and she takes each one of those, but she does it with such care and respect, but biblical and true, and it's just really, really good. And it has been a life changer for a lot of people. And
Her
one of
book,
her
Confronting
popular,
Christianity, too.
probably
I'd say her book, Confronting Christianity.
confronting Christianity,
Yeah.
confronting Jesus. All these are available, by the way, on Lifeway, which is cool.
Yeah.
And then the book that I have actually used with discipleship for teens, 10 questions every teen should ask and answer about Christianity. Now, let me say that again. 10 questions every teen should ask and answer about
Did
Christianity.
Rebecca write that one, or is that another author?
Now, Rebecca did.
Okay. Okay.
And I just did it with a study. The guys would read a chapter and get together and we'd talk about it. And so it's a great discipleship tool. It'd be great for a youth group. She's a very good, a careful writer, and a real nice, devoted person. I'm just really impressed with her. But see, these kinds of things help bridge the gap between I need to know more and I want them to know, and then you start doing these things, and kids love it. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
kids love it because they're diving in and beginning to think out loud about things that they've been keeping inside.
Yeah. Great book. There's. I'm gonna say one. AI is become like the thing. And I
Right.
was shocked that there's a great professor, mathematician, world-renowned apologist, Dr. John Lennox, and Dr. Lennox, who speaks every year for us at SLU 301, was commissioned. Somebody, I can't remember what publisher group did it, but commissioned him to do research on AI, and he's in his mid-70s, but research on AI and then projection of where you think, that'll take us in the next 20 to 50 years. And I remember I had about 400 students in London, and he came and he shared that research for 2 hours. You could have heard a pin drop. And the book ended up becoming 2084, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity. So there are some specific books written by apologists to specific issues. Rebecca does a great job of almost going, hey, listen, I know there's a host of questions, and I'm going to take the top 10 of them right here, But there are some books like what Dr. Lennox has written that specifically deal with this mega issue that's coming at us that nobody really fully understands, called AI. And I remember there was a moment, Doc, if you'll allow me just a rabbit trail. He was in the middle of his lecture, and I remember he stopped. And I thought, I was in the back of the room, and I'll be honest, I thought, oh my gosh, are we having, I'm going to say it this way, and if it's rude, I don't mean it to be, are we having an old man moment here? And he just stopped. And he just kind of stared off into the distance. And I kind of get on the edge of my seat at that point, like, am I going to have to jump up on the mic? And he goes, I like my garden. And I went, oh, Lord, we're having an old man moment, here we go. He goes, I like my garden. He said, I like my garden because I like to go out and sit and look through my telescope. And so here I am at the edge of my seat. He goes, and I love to look at the galaxy. And he could name constellations and galaxies, and he named a few. And then he stopped, and he looked at the room, and he said, students, no matter what happens with AI over the next 50 years, and it will drastically impact your life on a daily basis, never forget this one truth. You are more valuable to God than a galaxy. Mm-hmm. And I just remember the whole room went, wow, okay, I'm not scared of the future of AI anymore. That truth comforts me, And so what Rebecca does is she has a disarming approach that's also very comforting and equipping. And then I think Dr. Lennox has a way of doing that as well. Maybe it's that Irish accent, I don't know, but has a way of doing that as well.
He's one of my heroes. I tell you.
Yeah. What else would you add to that, Doc?
But his short book called "Can Science Explain Everything?"
Yeah,
it's gold. And a lot of questions I get from teens are they've been taught that you can't believe in science and believe in the Bible.
Right.
You can't be a scientist and be a Christian. All that stuff together. And his book is just, most of the top scientists are believers, which is, you never know that, throughout history. Mm-hmm. But that little book is just a real gem for people who want to understand how science and Christianity relate.
What about William Lane Craig? He's helpful for the big kind of behind the back, the existence of God type questions, the problem of evil type questions.
Right. Yeah, Bill Craig he's been at it a long time, and he's a good YouTuber. Mm-hmm. A lot of his discussions and questions that he answers are on YouTube and conferences and so on, and it's just really, really good. And sometimes when he gets with people like Richard Dawkins, he screws up his face. What? It's just delightful because it's like he's just pained that he made a statement like this and so on. But yeah, he is a good model for being able to answer those things as well. His books are great too.
They are. Now his books are a little heady. I'm gonna be honest.
They're very heady. That's why those sessions are really good.
Yeah, I prefer him in a YouTube format than some of those books. I have them on my shelf. Couple outlets. I think Sean McDowell's YouTube channel is very helpful.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
He addresses a question every time he does a show. It's always, and that's what he uses kind of as his, I don't want to say clickbait, but that's what he uses as his teaser. Like, we're going to answer this question. Is this really true? And then he'll spend 30 minutes dealing with it from a biblical worldview. And I know he's a good friend of yours and ours. Another good friend of ours is Elisa Childers.
Yeah.
And hers doesn't have a fancy name. It's just the Elisa Childers podcast. And
she's good.
She's focusing right now on the concept of deconstruction, which is I've found very helpful. I've had her teach at SLU several times. Very, very capable. I think it's helpful that she didn't start out as an apologist. She started out as a CCM artist,
Right.
And so she just has a way of talking that we all can understand,
Mhm.
And I think that's
Yeah.
kind of important.
I always tell her when I do an interview with her, I must say, I'm gonna form my questions in the form of Zoe Girl lyrics.
Which she
And she
probably
says,
both
"Oh,
loves and
please
hates.
don't."
Another one, and this one is I found myself listening to more and more, is a podcast called Southside Rabbi. Have you ever heard of that podcast, Doc?
Mm-mm, mm-mm.
What's the gentleman that runs that podcast? KB, but I know, but who's the other guy? Amin. So, have you ever heard of the artist KB?
Yeah.
Okay, so KB, phenomenal artist. He's a friend of ours and amazing. He does several things with us every year, but his podcast is, the depth of preparation and thinking, and his partner in that is a guy named Amin, and they have a great dialogue on I wouldn't say it's straight up apologetics, but wrestling with the questions that are apologetic questions, in a way that is disarming, but yet they're just sitting there with their Bibles open. And I found a lot of students like to listen to him. In fact, I asked my son last week, I said, "What podcast you listening to?" He said, "I know I'm supposed to say yours, Dad, but I've been listening to Southside Rabbi." And I went, okay. And he said, "I love it, man. It's just awesome." So that's another one that I've found very helpful. Access Ministries out of Colorado does the Culture Calculator. Is that what it's called?
Culture Translator.
Culture Translator. I'm sorry. And that's a free resource, isn't it, Doc?
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I encourage it on that, axis.org. They have conversation guides and for just about everything that's going on. In fact, and all their materials free. I served on the board there. Lynn and I did for a number of years, and that was our goal, to raise $6.5 million to make it all free. And they're constantly coming out with stuff. And the Culture Translator is a free resource that comes by email every Friday. You sign up for it, and you'll get like the top 10 things that have happened in culture that impact your youth.
Yeah.
And then they'll talk about how it does that and give some worldview stuff. And it's really nice. In fact, if it's so fresh that if I stand up and say something that's on there, the kids will go, "Wow, how do you know that?
How do you know that?
You're
Yeah.
old. How do you know that?"
That email, and I've looked at all their resources, but I think that Culture Translator is my favorite thing they do, because it's not, hey, here's what's happening over the last several months. No, here's what happened this week.
Yeah.
And you need to know about it. And one more I'd mention, and I mention this because he's been so helpful to SLU in the early days, is Dr. Danny Aiken, the president of Southeastern Seminary. And DanielAiken.com is his site. It's not all apologetic stuff, but he dedicates us a portion of that site to apologetics. And again, I would say Dr. Aiken, I almost called him Danny. Dr. Aiken really does the almost like a William Lane Craig. Let me help you get those categories solidified, and then show you how to address the real world questions as they come up. So that's one. Was there anything else you'd like to add to that list, Doc?
Well, there's a book coming out I just saw from a pastor here in North Carolina. His name is Dayton. Oh gosh, Hartman. Does that sound right? Dayton Hartman.
I don't know, Doc.
And it's the pastor as apologist, and the subtitle is something like "Restoring Apologetics to the Local Church."
Mm-hmm.
And those pastors and youth pastors might like that. I don't know. It's coming out in May, I think.
Yes, sir.
But his point was, just a subtitle tells you maybe apologetics has not been done or done well in the local church, and we need to get it fine-tuned.
Well, Doc, today what we've done is we've said, okay, apologetics is essentially strategic in the ongoing ministry of any church, and is increasingly more and more relevant to student ministry. We've said, secondly, that you've got to be able to be almost like you got to care about self-leadership. You got to be a self-taught person, in that you have a desire to go out and find answers to the questions that your students are wrestling through, We've named a lot of resources, and there's a lot more that people could do. Then you've got to create an environment. And there's a lot of ways you can create an environment. We gave a few examples of that. The next thing we said is that in that environment, you've got to continually reinforce the big, never-changing apologetic type questions. The existence of God, the problem of evil, the list could go on and on. It's actually not a terribly long list, but there's a list of questions that never change that are usually always behind a specific question that is asked. The ability to continually source your answer in the big picture of what God is doing and what he's communicated to us, and then to drill down on the specifics of that question is the strategy that is the most helpful and probably the most biblical. We saw Paul do this actually in the city of Athens in Acts 17. And so then we've said, okay, after that, you just need to be continually, like you said, daily, just absorbing content. And we tried to give, I think between us, we probably gave about 9 or 10 different examples, whether it be a book or a podcast or a YouTube channel or an Instagram. I mean, it's funny. William Lane Craig's is his Instagram accounts where he gets most of his traction. That's kind of funny for me to say out loud. But anyways, and so we've said you got to be somebody who's constantly being willing to dive into that. So we understand what it is. We understand how it fits. We understand a strategy, and then we need to continually be reinforcing our minds with resources. Is there anything else you'd add to that to say, listen, if you're going to care about apologetics, and you should, we need to think about this? Is there anything else that we haven't hit on that we should have?
No, just to highlight this cultural moment more than any time in history really needs good apologists.
Yes, sir.
Apologetics, particularly for young people. And because they are bombarded from every side constantly.
Right.
And that makes you an important vessel being used by God in their life.
Yes, sir.
And so I would just encourage you to enjoy this, because apologetics is actually fun.
Yes.
And but on the other hand, when it's true, it's life-changing for those kids, and you can change so many of them as they see themselves in a world that is just so anti-Christian at times, giving them some hope for the future. And so I want to encourage you to do just that, and encourage you. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to have answers at the tip of your tongue,
right,
or on the forward part of your brain. Give you some time to research, and you can stand up and then explain, and that's life changing. And do make discipleship apologetics as well.
Yes,
there's some good books and resources that you can do that with.
Well, thanks, Doc. This is our first of 12 conversations this year, and this first one is certainly did not disappoint. I'm glad we started here, because it's almost like we're starting with a kind of big issue that we'll be able to reference back to as we get more and more specific with different questions that youth pastors and youth workers have as we go throughout the year. So thank you so much for being willing to be our SLU Scholar in Residence. And ladies and gentlemen, if you've enjoyed this, I'm going to ask that you would do me a favor. Please subscribe to this channel so that you get the prompts every time that Dr. Brown comes on and we have a conversation. Also, if you'll leave questions or comments in the comment section down below, we will mine those questions and address those in the coming months. But thank you so much for tuning into this week's conversation. And until we meet again, wander well and shine like stars.